Good evening. My name is Marco Ouden, and I am your host on the Savvy Street Show. Your regular co-hosts are actually my guests tonight. Vinay Kolhatkar is the founder of the public intellectual e-zine, The Savvy Street, and a novelist, freelance editor, writer, and journalist. And Roger Bissell is a musician, philosopher, and editor. And this dynamic duo recently published Modernizing Aristotle's Ethics Toward a New Art and Science of Self-Actualization. Both are longtime fans of the works of Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivism, but both believe that objectivism is an unfinished work. Their recent book is part of their effort to modernize not just Aristotle's ethics, but objectivism as well. Tonight, we will be discussing their critique of objectivism and see how these ideas can be improved upon. Let's start by telling you my own connection to Ayn Rand and objectivism. It goes back to 1969. I was a commerce student at McGill University at the time. And this was in the heyday of the New Left, the anti-Vietnam War movement, hippies, the drug culture, and all that sort of stuff. And a friend of mine recommended reading Atlas Shrugged. But in fact, the first book of hers that I did read was that summer was Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. As a commerce student on a campus rife with anti-capitalist activism, Rand's anthology was a breath of fresh air, and it just blew me away. And over the next few years, I read everything she ever wrote. I joined an objectivist study group. I subscribed to her magazine. And living in Montreal at the time, twice I made the pilgrimage down to Boston to hear her speak. True to Rand's suggestions, I never called myself an objectivist. I called myself a student of objectivism. Over the years, particularly since the year 2000, I found myself questioning some aspects of objectivism and its offshoot libertarianism. But tonight I'm taking a neutral stance and will moderate a critical discussion on objectivism, asking relevant questions as they arise. First, let me get some short opening statements from both of our guests tonight. Vinay, can we start with you?
Sure, Marco. Thank you for having us. Firstly, I think I heard that libertarianism is kind of an offshoot of objectivism. Let me say that it absolutely isn't. The charge from Rand that they steal my politics or from ARI that it's plagiarizer politics is completely wrong. Libertarianism is based on essentially classical liberalism. Libertarianism is a new word coined in the United States because the word liberalism was stolen, and in Australia and in Europe, it remains as is. Liberal meant classical liberal. And those ideas go all the way back to the Age of Reason and John Locke particularly, and also the Declaration of Independence. So in my journey, I would say there were 4 phases. I read Atlas Shrugged when I was 14, and it took me a month to read it. Tremendous awe and excitement. A couple of years later, at 16 years and I think 10 months, I was due to enter university. And it created a huge negative problem for me because there was an enormous social pressure. I was growing up in India at the time from parents and society to do either engineering or medicine. And I eventually chose engineering. But one of the problems I had from age 14 to 16 was the way Ayn Rand glorified the physical sciences, even though she never was herself a scientist, or an engineer, or like Kira is an engineer, John Galt is an inventor. And funnily enough, I used to think that these are sort of science, etc., boring subjects. And I was more interested in the humanities, which I sort of where I ended up much later after much grief, after finishing the engineering degree. And I don't blame Rand, but it was the inadvertent effect of reading Atlas Shrugged too early and getting the concrete sort of not as an abstraction, but I know something must be wrong with me because all these wonderful people love all their physical sciences and engineering. So in my second phase, I was just concentrating on my career. In my sort of third phase, which started in 2009, I really began to look at objectivism in earnest. And a few years ago, there might have been about 4 or 5 years ago, I started reading some back issues of the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. And there was one by Eric Mack, and I had long suspected that Ayn Rand shuffles in that essay between a man called man and just man, and survival and flourishing as well, survival and happiness. And I found all the answers there, and I began to think more and more that there are errors in objectivism that deserve to be fixed. And I found a very able co-author in Roger Bissell, and we ended up writing Modernizing MAE, which, as you said, is also modernizing objectivism.
That's okay. I should note here that Rand didn't just glorify engineers and everything. One of the key people in her book is Hugh Axton, who's a philosopher, and I think in many ways she regarded you as being more important than some than Robert Statler, who was an actual scientist. So I think you followed the right path there. Roger, let's go to you and hear from you on your opening statement.
Well, thanks, Marco. Another very important person, hero in Atlas Shrugged was Richard Haley, the composer. and because I'm a musician, the name Haley kind of jumped out at me because I remembered the earliest band I ever remember when I was a little kid was Bill Haley and the Comets.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you consider yourself a student of objectivism, and I guess I would call myself a lifelong learner. So I'm a student of whatever I can get my hands on, right? I do consider myself like a post-Randian objectivist. In other words, she's not around anymore, and so it's sort of like a person might be a post-Kantian idealist. Well, I'm a post-Randian objectivist, and I'm not going to put that in a title of anything that I write. It'll be in the acknowledgments that this is my orientation, and so it's not going to be authorized or anything like that. But I guess you want a little bit of a personal history. In 1966, I was a senior in high school, and my high school music teacher gave me this little newsletter, this essay by Nathaniel Branden called Benevolence versus Altruism. And I didn't get much from it. I was just a music, like a band geek, and I loved math. And then she gave me Atlas Shrugged. And that was definitely a conversion experience. I quickly read all of her other novels and essays. And I think it had one very immediate effect on me. It took about a year to unfold, but as I was getting ready for college, it was, is it going to be math or is it going to be music? So I just waited to see what the colleges would come up with for scholarship offers. And as it turned out, I was getting scholarship offers for math, but not for music. And I thought, well, maybe that's my destiny. I know it sounds kind of passive, but so I ended up going to a college as a math major. But halfway through my freshman year, the jazz band director said, "Hey, they're starting a music degree program next year." They didn't have one; they just had bands and choruses. And would you be interested? I said, "Yeah." So I switched to a double major, math and music, and then my third year, I dropped math down to a minor, and I never looked back. I do love math, but it was getting just a little bit hairy and abstract for me. So during college, I had a lot of questions about objectivism that are still mostly unanswered. Free will and mind-body problem, the theory of knowledge, ethics and politics, aesthetics, especially aesthetics, because being a musician. And I've been writing about them since graduate school, really. For the time being, if people are interested in what I've written to date, they can look on my website, which is pretty easy to find. It's rogerbissell.com. It doesn't get much easier than that. There's also back issues of the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. I've done a lot of pieces for that. Reason Papers, if they have a website with all their archives, the Savvy Street website. And I've got 2 philosophy books on Amazon. And then there are 3 books from the past, 5 years, I guess. The Dialectics of Liberty, which I co-edited and wrote in, and the book Defending Liberty, for which I wrote the lead essay. And you can get that through the Mises Institute. And then the book that I co-wrote with Vinay last year, Modernizing Aristotle's Ethics. So I've been really happy about getting to do these things in the last few years, and I'm just really fired up, anxious to do more.
Great. Before we go ahead.
I just needed to clarify. There's a demonstration effect of fiction, and Axton and Haley or Halley, they're all backbenchers. And also, I used to think science is boring, and I kind of thought, well, wait a minute, if Francisco and Dagny find it so exciting, why shouldn't I? And that was my conflict. Anyway, over to you, Marco.
Yeah, I just wanted to go ahead.
Also, I didn't even actually tie the loose end on what I was saying. Dagny's mantra was "Don't let it go," right? She said that when she took a break from the railroad and went up to the cabin, and she just kept hearing this thought, "Don't let it go." And I really wanted it to be in music, and I just thought that somehow I'll find a way to get back to it, and then it worked out. So it was like, don't let it go. And that was a lesson to me. It was, if you really, really want something, find a way to make it happen.
Right. Before we continue, I just want to go back to something that Vinay mentioned here, and that is that I had referred to libertarianism as an offshoot of objectivism, and he disagreed with that. And I can see his point, but I think it's because I came across objectivism and Ayn Rand first that I followed a lot of the general thrust of the objectivist movement, that libertarianism was a cheap copycat of objectivism and an offshoot. And I bought right into that, and I think maybe my comment reflected that. This still lingers in the back of my mind to a certain extent. And I think it certainly continues in today's objectivism movement, that libertarianism is a poor copy of objectivism. But I want to get to our next question. Roger, you've got such a long history with objectivism, also as a contributor to the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. Did objectivism ever have a mojo? And what do we mean by having a mojo? And did they lose it? And can objectivism regain it? So let's go to Roger first for his thoughts on that.
Sure. Mojo, momentum, a feeling of dynamic forward progress, building, developing, growing, a sense of excitement that the best is yet to come and it's just getting better and better. I think this really was the reality of objectivism probably for about 10 years. In the early 1960s, that was the heyday. After Atlas Shrugged came out in 1957, Nathaniel and Barbara Brandon convinced Rand to really go public, making more personal appearances, outreach. And she started talking on campuses and the Ford Hall Forum in Boston, and she had a weekly radio program. And she also had a monthly newsletter and books on ethics, politics, and epistemology. And things were really rolling along. And then it abruptly ended in 1968. Rand had a permanent parting of ways with the Brandons. And after that, the movement, from my own experience, seemed like it was a pale reflection of itself, even though they kept trying to extend the success by renting out recorded lectures. Leonard Peikoff, Joan and Alan Blumenthal did lectures on music, which were quite good. There was another split in 1990 when David Kelly was ejected from the Ayn Rand Institute. and his views, they just didn't agree with them and didn't want to tolerate them. He wanted to open objectivism to changes. He said Rand and the rest of them were too moralizing and judgmental. And he also said he had some sympathy toward, I think, toward Barbara Brandon's book, The Passion of Ayn Rand. And this whole pattern just continued over the years. Some of the brightest minds were tossed out, and we can name quite a few of them. And to me, that's one of the two main reasons that objectivism lost its momentum and never really fully got it back. Personalities and social control became more important than the philosophy. And because of all that turmoil and chaos, even though there's millions of dollars of financial support over the decades, I don't think the level and quality, there was a considerable quantity of lectures, especially Leonard Peikoff, but the quality of the creative and productive thought from the 1960s never really came back. Um, and I owe that partly to the Brandons, and Rand had a huge volume of creative thought back then. The other major reason is that control of the purity of the philosophy became more important than exploration and development of philosophy and correcting its errors. In other words, the philosophy became more important than the truth. So it was personalities and social control became more important than the philosophy, and the philosophy became more important than the truth. So sitting on top of everything is control, you know. I won't say the dreaded P word, but control. And this became official in 1990 when Kelly was kicked out and Leonard Peikoff imposed this doctrine of closed objectivism. And from then on, nothing new. Well, actually, from Rand's death in 82, nothing new, no matter how obviously correct it was and consistent with objectivism, was part of objectivism. And to me, for any respecting creative intellectual, that's got to be insulting. It's got to be demotivating. And I think it hobbled and stagnated the progress of the philosophy. So there's the other part of the answer to your Mojo question, the momentum. You can't get ahead of steam built up if somebody's holding down the lid. So I think going forward, the future is going to be dim unless and until the movement realizes that what it should be doing is not trying to not merely to preserve the truths that Ayn Rand did discover, but to challenge the parts of her philosophy that have errors and to allow thinkers who are able and good thinkers to fill the gaps in her philosophy.
Right. Vinay, what's your take on this?
In my first and second phase, the first phase is very short. I never experienced a mojo. In my third phase in my career within Australia, I tried to, distribute some of Rand's paperbacks like The Voice of Reason and engage with people. But I actually found nobody who had even read anything beyond the Fountainhead. Then in my third phase, it was sort of entering the internet era, and I found a lot of people. But most of the Facebook groups that feature Ayn Rand or objectivism have members below 5,000. And even Yaron Brook estimated a total population of objectivists around the entire world is between being 5 and 10,000. In his foreword to the Leonard Peikoff dim hypothesis book, which, it's sort of getting to about 10 years or 15 years ago. So I think there is no more about 5,000 people. And libertarianism has also struggled. And part of the reason they are currently losing even more is that there is, I believe, a lot of Rand mimicry going on in the major establishment. So take, for instance, there was an attempt on Donald Trump, an assassination attempt. And none of us have jumped to the conclusion that, it was an inside job, or most of us haven't. But we're leaving that door open. We're looking at the evidence about how slack the security can be. But driven by the hatred of Trump, a lot of objectivists will not leave that door open to say, well, maybe there was. They don't buy the existence of a deep state. But when it comes to the climate alarm, they're vociferous that alarm is absolutely false. And the only way it can continue is the entire deep state, the entire administrative state, by definition, all the bureaucracies, plus the media, plus the academe, all sing the same song. And that's why the climate alarm exists. When we had the lockdowns in the mRNA, there was incredible amount of evidence about the leak being from a lab, the lab being funded by the US government. Why should the lab even exist? There were lots of prophylactics and cures that were proven. They were just not internet talk. They were journal papers, not on ivermectin, but on NAC, very early, late 2020, early 21, and on methylene blue. And the media was damping it down, but the establishment just went along with whatever the mainstream media was saying. And that's like conflating reason and science. Just because a vaccine is science doesn't mean it's absolutely reasonable. And they've lost subscribers out of that. So there are some institutional difficulties, because of which I think even the others are primarily RAND marketing organizations rather than for the discovery of philosophical truths. So I'm pessimistic about the Mojo.
Okay. I just want to get at one thing here, though, is, I know our focus is on objectivism and Ayn Rand, but did libertarianism as such ever have a Mojo? And was that ever anything like the objectivist movement's Mojo? I'm thinking that, if we look at Rand and separate her from the movement, from the Nathaniel Branden Institute and the active movement to promote her philosophy, her books still sell in the millions, and Atlas Shrugged sells about 300,000 copies a year. I don't think there's any other libertarian-oriented book that can even close to match the sales of Atlas Shrugged. So maybe if you look at Rand as separate from the movement, Rand still has a lot of mojo if she's selling 300,000 copies of Atlas Shrugged a year.
Absolutely, and that's the unanswered question. I was going to bring that up later, that Rand will continue to sell. I'm not pessimistic about Rand's prospects in her estate getting money from the sales, but you look at the percentage of those who are reading Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead converting to objectivism, and it's very, very, very low indeed.
Yeah, movies sell a lot better than lectures, and novels sell a lot better than nonfiction books. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. People love stories. They may, if they're really nerdy, love lessons, but most people really prefer to get their lessons and their inspiration from drama. It's just the way we are. That's the way most people are wired, I think.
Right. Yeah. Well, I know from personal experience, this is just a little anecdote, but when my daughter was in high school, in grade 11 or 12, she had a very progressive teacher, and I looked over some of her materials that she brought home, and I thought a lot of it was really quite left-wing tinged. So I sent a letter to her teacher saying that I objected to the way that she was handling the course, that it was slanted and it was unbalanced. And I said that, capitalism is not a dirty word, and that I strongly recommend balancing out with some other views, and that I recommended reading Atlas Shrugged. Now, I never heard from the teacher back on that, but a few years later, after my daughter graduated high school, and that teacher contacted me and asked me to go and speak to her class about objectivism and libertarianism. And as it turns out, she took my advice and she actually read Atlas Shrugged, and she says it changed her life. She said it inspired her to go and get her master's degree. She had not had that ambition before. So, Atlas Shrugged really is a life-changing book, even for people who are avowedly on the left wing of politics.
Wow.
I said, I guess better go on to our next question here. You've both written and spoken about the banishment of the Brandens and attacks on natural allies like libertarians. One might say that objectivism lost its mojo when it excommunicated Nathaniel Branden. Did this policy of excommunication and attacks continue after Branden's? were forced out. What's been the impact of that? I think you've discussed this to some extent as well already, but let's just go, Vinay, just comment a bit more on how this process has continued.
Well, to my knowledge, it has absolutely continued after 1990. Roger mentioned the big split with David Kelly over open versus closed objectivism. But a very, very fine economist, George Reisman, who was very much in the Randian, Misesian tradition, anti-anarchy, anti-Rothbard's anarchy position, was for, I believe, over petty reasons excommunicated. There was David Harriman left for some reasons, and then prior to or just after Harriman, John McCaskey, who was on the board of ARI, wrote a 3-star review of Harriman's book, and he was purged. And what happens with these purges? It creates a climate of fear. I mean, I have worked in organizations or in my corporate career, and the thing that suffers the most is creativity when you have that kind of purging. And that's the kind of biggest negative. The other thing I find is in the mimicry of Ayn Rand, we must avoid, the establishment must avoid any association with libertarians. So Ron Paul was an outstanding candidate. He had a better grasp of individual rights, in my opinion, more than any other political candidate ever. But the Ayn Rand Institute, I believe, was dismissive of Ron Paul. They said, oh, but he doesn't even understand banking. Now, there is a big debate going on between fractional reserve banking and the so-called free banking school. And in my opinion, FRB is not fraudulent, but there are valid issues within that. And the free banking school, when it says maturity transformation of banking is banking, I think is an absurd statement. But anyway, there is a debate, right? So even if Ron Paul was wrong about banking, they should have endorsed him. And even through the primaries, he was often coaching others in the Constitution. The other thing I find is George Selgin, an economist, has appeared on Ayn Rand's shows, etc. And he's not a pure free market person in the sense that he hasn't been anti-central banking. And if central banking exists, automatically what happens is there is no free market because you're bastardizing interest rates. Euphemistically, it's called monetary policy, by the way. And there is a lender of last resort facility with the Fed, which is there with every central bank, and therefore all banks are effectively subsidized. And a far better proponent of this view is the Austrian Economic School and Mises Institute. But any association and alliance with them must be avoided because they're libertarians. So I think this kind of purging and acting on Rand's worst personality traits, unfortunately, is still ongoing.
Yeah, the banishing and purging took place a lot before Rand's death too, and one of the main examples is Murray Rothbard, who was a prominent libertarian thinker. He gave Atlas Shrugged maybe its most generous laudatory review it ever got, and she broke off with him supposedly because he would not divorce his Christian wife. This was around maybe 1958, 60, somewhere in there, really in the early days. Then there was John Hospers, whom she had an intellectual correspondence with for a year or two. He was a university professor, philosopher, journal editor. He also published a college text called Introduction to Philosophical Analysis. And I think it was in the second or third edition where he included and favorably discussed two major chunks of Rand's views about ethics and concepts. And he opened his journal, The Personalist, to numerous writers who were objectivist-oriented writers. And she broke off with him because he supposedly embarrassed her in front of some academics when she presented her theory of aesthetics. And a third example, again, someone who was in the early days trying to associate with the objectivist movement. He was Tibor Machan, a longtime friend of mine. He was a Hungarian immigrant who went on to become a university professor, an extremely prolific writer. He was one of the founders of the Reason Foundation, and he wrote well over a dozen books. He was editor of Reason Papers, which had a similar open policy for objectivist-oriented writers. He championed both libertarianism and objectivism for all of his active career, but he was given the boot. In other words, stay away, because he asked too many annoying questions after the objectivist lectures. And all three of these examples happened before 1965, well before the Brandons were ousted. And I think this kind of loss, a brain drain of really prolific and energetic thinkers, is a terrible blow to a movement. And sometimes you just don't want to admit it. You just want to go on and get the hence, But a couple more examples. Edith Ephron, who wrote in The Objectivist, was also I think a novelist, but she wrote for TV Guide, and she was into analyzing television news bias. And her brother, the neurophysiologist Robert Ephron, he wrote some really good things about physiology and consciousness that were also in The Objectivist. They were lost when the Brandon split happened. So, but as Vinay points out, there are many, many examples, decade after decade, over and over, that there's this hemorrhage of good thinkers. And I think as far as the attack specifically on libertarianism by the objectivists, and Vinay is correct, there's been this, well, Rand said it, therefore it must be true, so I have to appear objectivist and virtuous by saying it too. I think it's unjustified. I think it's very foolish. There is this syndrome. I think of it as kind of like a derangement in objectivism that Rand herself started. It's like looking through the wrong end of the telescope, and you make small differences look huge and unacceptable. And the Rothbard, Hospers, McCann, I think those are examples. She also angrily denounced and rejected Ronald Reagan. I remember 1975, he came to Nashville and he spoke at Vanderbilt University, and he said, I am a libertarian. I said, oh, really? I thought you were a Republican. Anyway, she denounced him and rejected him because he would not separate himself from the pro-life movement unequivocally. And he's the one who gave by far the best speech supporting Barry Goldwater in 1964, who Rand was supporting for president. So of all times, and this is, I'll conclude, of all times in Western civilization, this is not the time to burn bridges to potential allies in the fight, because it's almost all hands on deck. And if you're pulling up the drawbridge and saying, no, you can't come in, how are we going? Divided we fall, right? That's the way I look at it.
Yeah. One person you didn't mention is a very early influence on Rand, who had a tremendous influence and whom she later severed ways with, was Isabel Patterson, the author of The God of the Machine. That might have been the first casualty in the war. And another aspect of this is that the way this whole thing went with these purges and this, there's a correct way of thinking and there's a not orthodox way that's verboten, is her influence on people within the movement, like Leonard Peikoff. Ann Heller tells a telling story that Rand's favorite composer was Rachmaninoff, and she was into the romanticist movie. Tchaikovsky was okay, and Chopin was okay. But one day she decided that, or she spoke out against Brahms. And Peikoff, who was a big Brahms fan, hastily went and got rid of all his Brahms recordings.
Oh, no.
This is
no.
Ann Heller tells that story in her biography. And, so not only does did she have, not only did the movement purge people, but it had a chilling effect on the people that stayed in the movement,
Right.
that they toe the line.
Right.
So that's a negative effect as well.
Oh,
But let's continue. When you speak of the errors in objectivism, are you talking about fundamentals, about objectivism's basic premises, or are you talking about faulty reasoning from some of those premises, or are perhaps talking about completeness? Maybe there's room for amendment and expansion of the objectivist corpus. Roger, can you comment on that?
yeah. Well, way back decades ago, there was a list of 7 or 8 basic principles of objectivism, and I could look at that and say, "Oh yeah, that's I agree with all those," and I still do. So if that's the checklist, yeah, I'm in. Um, I agree with the axioms. I agree with capitalism and reason and purpose and self-esteem and concepts and logic and Aristotle's laws of logic. Um, I have a couple of examples, and one of them is a gap that led to an error, and one is an error that led to a gap. I just realized that was kind of a simple way of putting it. I'll give you the first one. Rand had some wonderful, fruitful insights, and there were some gaps in her ideas, and the insights could be used to help fill those gaps. She had how we form concepts. She had this idea of unit perspective. If you see things as units that belong, members of a group of similar things, then you can form concepts, and that's how you do it. I think it's profoundly important. It's, to me, the master key for understanding logic, not just concepts, but also how we form propositions, how we form arguments and theories, the whole thing. And if it were properly applied, this insight of hers, a reasonably intelligent person, follower of hers, who was interested in concept theory, could easily fill in this gap of how we form propositions. Instead, to this very day, all we in the official movement is Harry Binswanger's book, How We Know. And he has this chapter on propositions that I get the shivers and I shudder when I think about it, because it's awful. He completely abandons Rand's insight about the unit perspective and the file folder metaphor for how we hold our concepts. And the only antidote to this, other than consigning it to the flames, don't do that, just keep it over there, is I've got a book called What's in Your Concept Hierarchy. And if somebody wants another way of understanding all this, read chapter 1 of my book. The other, so it started out with a gap, like we don't have a theory of propositions, and then to fill it, Harry Binswanger came up with this hugely erroneous chapter. Okay, and then the other example is an error that led to a gap. And again, interestingly, Rand and Harry Binswanger are involved in it. I didn't do this on purpose, I swear. On the second page of Art and Cognition, Rand makes what I think is a gross logical error. And if you believe Leonard Peikoff, I just read his Fact and Value essay today, and he says if there's any error in a philosophy, then the whole philosophy is out. No. It's not that bad. It can be fixed, but they say, no, it can't. Well, Rand says architecture is a form of art, and art by definition is the recreation of reality, but architecture does not recreate reality. Huh? That is a contradiction. At least one of those 3 claims, at least one, can't be true. And yet, warts and all, that's part of official objectivism, and we're supposed to take it in as though Aristotle's law of contradiction doesn't apply to aesthetics. So there's the error. It can't be corrected because it's official objectivism, and how dare you? But it gets worse. Binswanger deleted architecture from the Ayn Rand lexicon. She wrote a whole book on architecture, and it's not in the lexicon. She devoted a paragraph or two in her aesthetics book about architecture. It's not in the lexicon. So, I mean, is that the way to fix errors? Just throw them down the memory hole? No. Uh, this is it's an endemic thing, if I'm saying the word right. They won't even not acknowledge there are errors, let alone allow them to be fixed. Instead, they cover them up, or they do a bunch of verbal tap dancing, and Fred Astaire would blush if he saw it. I just think it's not tolerable. It's treasonous to Ayn Rand by their own standards that they apply to us, but not to themselves. They say, don't you dare try to fix the mistake. Well, Binswanger fixed the mistake by throwing it out, keeping it out of the book where it rightfully belonged, even though it was a mistake. It should have been in there. Well, I'll let that suffice. I just think it's okay to love Ayn Rand and objectivism, but you should love facts and truth more. Otherwise, we're in a cult, right?
Yeah.
You're not an independent individual. You're not in a vibrant, healthy intellectual movement. And there are a lot of breakthrough ideas that could be absorbed into objectivism if they would just open the doors a little bit. But those ideas are either going to wither and die away, or they're going to go somewhere else. And that's what happens. That's what happens when you're too insulated.
Yeah. Yeah. Vinay, can you add to that?
Sure.
Briefly, I mean, firstly, I think just a few instances of what's wrong. The theory of sexuality has not perhaps made it into objectivism, but Rand's theory of sexuality and sexual attraction was, at the very least, grossly incomplete, if not wrong, and it's what primarily caused the Rand-Brandon split. And we go into that, how it did so in our book, The Modernizing Aristotle's Ethics. Secondly, if you apply her standards of value and virtue, the definitions, by those definitions of values and virtues, Adolf Hitler was virtuous when he was, conquering Poland and attacking Hungary and killing Jews and all the rest of it. And what that does when you use terms like that, now terms like selfishness and altruism, she wrote a book, obviously titled, all of you know, The Virtue of Selfishness. And she took the definition of selfishness from the American Collegiate Dictionary of 1956. Now, that even in that dictionary, it may or may not have been the only connotation, but clearly the kind of brute that tramples over others has always been a strong connotation of the word selfish, even in the dictionaries. Certainly the mainstream ones today, if you look at them, all of them more likely to categorize at number one, Attila the Hun, her favorite villain, one of her favorite villains, as selfish. And then there's the word altruism, which is consonant for many minds with kindness or compassion, or living with other people. But she's taken altruism to mean self-sacrifice, which partially it does, and a French philosopher, Comte used that definition, and she's attacking Comte. But that was, 60 years ago. Today, when objectivists talk to people, they're not heard. It's like they're not talking in English. And that, to me, is, one of the major drawbacks. We spoke about the errors in objectivist ethics. Rand makes implicit claims, like one, she claims that she has solved Hume's paradox, and it is absolutely untrue. And she leads a lot of objectivists to believe, and objectivists believe, that she has discovered certain laws of nature. She has discovered the one and only true ethic. And that's, again, absolutely untrue. She actually uses Immanuel Kant's universalization principle. She uses his phrase, man is an end in himself without attribution. And in fact, the universalization principle was also used by John Locke in his second treatise on government. She uses some of the concepts Isabel Patterson writes in The God of the Machine without attribution as well. So the whole thing needs to be relooked at, especially the ethics. And as far as the establishment is concerned, I thought the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, I got to it very late, but was a magnificent history of ideas for 20 years, and not a single person from the bigger establishment, the RI, ever contributed an essay in JARS. That's what Roger tells me, nor did they ever come in there to defend Rand. And that's a very sorry state of affairs. And which goes back to, are we just doing marketing of Ayn Rand, or are we after philosophical truth? And I think the former is the answer. So I think, yeah, these problems, we've just seen a sprinkling from Roger and me. I don't think they can be fixed when you have basically close to open ideas, close to new ideas.
Yeah. I like to say that in defense of Rand, she actually explicitly said at some point, and I don't remember the exact location where she said this, but she had said something to the effect that she doesn't want people to blindly follow her philosophy. She wants them to intellectually agree with her philosophy, to study it, to understand it, and say, yes, this is right. But there was this climate of fear, this climate of intimidation that sort of stifled that. So, was that the fault of Rand, or was that the fault of her followers? Brandon admits that it helped create this climate of fear to a certain extent. So, is this a contradiction? Another contradiction within Rand, that she had said, I want you to understand this by rational means, not by intimidation. But she violated this idea.
Yeah, both. I think Rand probably did create a climate of fear within her group, but then it's unfortunately didn't have to be. Its worst personality traits do not have to be mimicked, but they have been. So it's both.
Yeah. Okay, Vinay, let's go on to how objectivism is marketed. How is it marketed today, and what was your opinion of that?
Okay, I think firstly that there is a problem within, unless you open objectivism into a much wider universe of the sort of age of reason thinkers, and you study Aristotle, you study some of the back issues of JARS, and you study a variety of other thinkers, John Locke, Isabel Patterson, and so on. Unless and until you do that, if you market objectivism as a closed system, then it's really a marketing exercise. And the idea that I've heard that some of the establishment ideas are only to market it to intellectual leaders who can then change the culture. And to that extent, they've invited, I believe, some, big figures like Jordan Peterson, Dennis Prager, they might call Sam Harris, but these guys didn't get to where they are based on an objectivist philosophy or even a strong affiliation with Rand. So I think that's destined to fail, especially when you get Peterson to talk at the conference and then later on criticize him. And I'm fine with criticizing Peterson. I think he does have plenty of flaws. So I'm unfortunately pessimistic about the way it's structured now. I don't think you can market it well at all.
Roger, can you add to that?
Yeah, well, I can give a little historical perspective and then kind of look in on how things are now. Atlas Shrugged came out in 1957. They all had high hopes in her inner circle that it was going to change the world. And then apparently no academics stepped forward to say, yes, this is good, true, and beautiful. So she fell into despair, and the Brandons said, well, you know what? The best audience is not the older intellectuals, but the wave of the future, the young people, the high school and the college age and young professionals. Many of the people my age were back in that time were the best and the brightest, especially independent scholars who were sympathetic to objectivism and yet weren't like completely in the main groups. And a lot of us were college kids. We didn't have a lot of spare cash. We laid down our money for newsletters and books and lecture courses, and it meant something to us. It was an investment, you know. Um, and I think it paid off for the movement. I mean, it certainly paid off for us because it was exciting and it helped us grow intellectually. But I don't know that the official objectivist uh, groups still understand what was unleashed back then, and they're still not haven't figured out how to mutually advantage themselves and us. Now, I really don't like what I'm seeing, not saying. Um, the outreach to both the young and the older intellectuals has really gone off the rails. Vinay has pointed out about the Jordan Peterson and Dennis Prager, I guess, and so on. Uh, but it looks kind of hollow and kind of transparent. I don't see how much good is going to come of it. I don't think it's bad. I just think they're putting a lot more uh, currency in it than is really there. But the worst thing I see is what they're doing with the young people. They seem to think it's a good idea to shovel free books and free internet material and scholarships to conferences to young people who may not even be sure it's something they want, and who have practically no skin in the game because they're not asked to make an investment in the process. It's just show up and we'll get you in free. I don't think that's going to produce much. I mean, there may be a rare exception, but if young people aren't asked to put some money down for the insight and the information they're getting, I don't know if they're going to take it seriously. And I do think this is a problem with the broader culture. But objectivism, these marketing attempts seem to be falling into that error instead of putting a price tag on the ideas so as to really show that they have a value. Um, so uh, I think I join Vinay in thinking that I don't see a lot of reason to be optimistic about the marketing directions that have been used so far.
Okay. Let's go to our last question here.
Yeah.
You know, there's been 65 years of official objectivism without the hope for success. Now, I think you and I might disagree on this. I think objectivism has been more successful than we tend to think it has been. But because we expect it to conquer the world and everybody's going to turn into an objectivist. But is that a realistic hope? That we're could be a mass conversion and mass movement and everything like that. Is it even a philosophy that can lend itself to a mass movement? But do you think objectivism can ever achieve this sort of success that we're looking for, or do we need an alternative that can achieve this? Roger, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I look at objectivism now the same way I did 60 years ago, as a possible vehicle for getting people from where we are today to a freer, more sane and rational, and a happier world. And I'm looking at the vehicle and I'm saying, back then I thought it was like this wonderful engine of progress and development and insight and so on. And I looked at the heroes in Atlas Shrugged and I thought, okay, where are they? I mean, I really, that was my belief, was that objectivism was going to nurture and help to create these wonderful heroes. And I mean, you guys are heroes. You're terrific people, and I have a lot of friends that I think a lot of. But uh, we are doing good things despite the fact that we're not really part of the official engine that's being taken care of by these people, who you would think they'd keep it in good running order. They'd get new tires, they'd have a servicing, and keep it in good shape so that it's getting better and better. But instead they have frozen it, and now they're just chewing the ideas. And if it serves your own individual life, wonderful, because that's what we're here for. That's why we're here, is to have a good individual life. However, as far as changing the world, um, I don't know. I don't know if it has to get its act together first. And if it gets its act together, then I think it has a chance. But if it doesn't, then I think the energy is going to either dissipate or it's going to go somewhere else. And like I said, we need energetic and intellectually honest leaders who play fair and keep an open mind. And that's why it's so great to work with people like Chris Gabbara that I worked with for over 20 years, and for Vinay for the last several years, and doing these podcasts. These are a way to allow new voices. We've done a lot of interviews, new ideas, meeting with people, working with them. And I wouldn't have been able to do this if I hadn't gotten into objectivism in the first place. So good things happen. But I haven't given up on objectivism as a powerful set of ideas, a source of inspiration and friendship. But I just don't know if it's going to become the effective vehicle toward the rational, libertarian, humane society that we would like to live in. I just don't know. And that's why I feel kind of sad and kind of pessimistic, even while I'm enjoying my life because of objectivism.
Vinay, can you add to that?
Okay. Very recently, I believe the Ayn Rand Institute has started happiness workshops. And because the CEO said he discovered a lot of objectivists are not happy. And that's very much been my anecdotal experience. Now, for a philosophy that purports to have happiness as the final goal and gives you all the formulae, it isn't working, at least not on the bare threads that are presented in some small books. And, you know, objectivists often compare some sort of parasitism. You'll never be happy if you're a bank robber or a predator or a parasite. And that's true. I think we we say that too in MAE because there is an internal conflict.
Right.
But sometimes a lack of knowledge, ignorance is bliss, and some incredibly evil people, according to the standards of objectivism or libertarianism, have become happy and they have lived very long. I mean, Alan Greenspan is 99 or 98 and still going, and he's had a magnificent career in a conventional sense. Barack Obama always smiles year to year. Al Gore is tremendously successful and a billionaire. So, and these guys look incredibly happy relative to most of the people who are purists. And it's because of the world we live in. And the world we live in is not just Soviet Russia, in which case even Rand says Kira is going to die and Leo is going to die spiritually. And she shows a Howard Rock. It's a novel. So Howard Rock succeeds in remaining very serene and becoming incredibly happy. Today, if Howard Rock walked out of an architectural school in his final year, he wouldn't have the certificate to say he is an architect. And even if you wanted to commission him, you won't be able to in some regulations because he's not a qualified architect. So there is, I believe, a decisive need for a whole new movement. I've currently called it natural rights humanism because we also need to get rid of gatekeepers, purges, and bring in our close allies from the libertarian world, which you said, yes, that too hasn't succeeded. Kind of, I mean, Javier Milei is president of Argentina, and he's not president because all of a sudden lots of Argentinians became libertarian. It's a sort of a reaction, and the reaction can go towards a Hitler or a Milei. Thankfully, in Argentina, they got a Milei. Well, let's see whether he succeeds. So that movement has some success. But even in that movement, I see a gap, not only the factionalism between the Beltway libertarians, Reason and Cato, versus the Mises, the real libertarians, I call them. But when Jeffrey Tucker introduced his concept of brutalism, and he got a lot of flack for it, because libertarianism is essentially only a political philosophy based on non-aggression axioms. So, and even libertarians agree, we need a complete philosophy, but just not at the government level, at the personal level. So I'm kind of hopeful that maybe some academics and some other public intellectuals will get on board with this concept of natural rights humanism. Sorry, Roger.
No, I was just pointing to you as somebody as you, my friend. No, I think we talked about this recently. I think scientific natural rights humanism. That's the mantle that I would proudly wear.
Okay, well, let's make it scientific natural rights humanism, because there is a scientific one, but there
Yeah.
isn't a humanism based on natural rights. And in fact, if it isn't based on natural rights, to me, it's not humane to start with. Existentialism is a humanism Sartre claims in his book, but it isn't. So, well, let's hope we can, either, change, which I think is very unlikely, objectivism, or introduce a new movement which will, really infuse and encourage scholars and creators and have no gatekeepers. Automatically, there is a body of literature that would come in if it has also got a new journal and so on.
It'd be nice to have one word of 3 or 4 syllables for to name our philosophy, wouldn't it? Like sign nat rye hum or something.
Yeah.
I just, I'm attached to the old-fashioned idea of liberalism in its classical sense. I really think that, the word liberalism belongs to libertarians and objectivists. It's being usurped by the left, and it's time to reclaim it. But that's my view. But do you have a last comment? And
Yeah, I agree with classical liberalism. If you can reclaim it, that pretty much also embraces natural rights, embraces a scientific epistemology and a scientific metaphysics.
Yeah. My only final comment is onward and upward.
Onward and upward. On that cheery note, I would like to thank our guests, Roger and Vinay, for their valuable insights into this conflict. And I'd like to thank our guests, our audience, for joining in with us and listening to this discussion. And on that note, I'll say good night and good luck.
Thank you.